Tonight you're not chasing the morning. You are sitting at the edge of the first night where the world still hasn't decided what it will be, and that indecision feels strangely kind. Before you fall asleep, you'll walk into Hermopolis the way you walk into a quiet room, softly, on purpose, letting the dark stay intact. You'll meet creation not as a shout, but as a slow stirring marsh water moving, reeds holding their breath, mud remembering and then forgetting. And you'll listen for the 8 names that came before the sun frog-headed and serpent-headed forces. Not characters, but conditions. The ingredients of dawn before it becomes a day. 3 small senses to keep you company. Marsh reeds shiver like thin paper in the wind. A single frog call echoes once and decides that's enough. And black water holds the first starlight without spilling it. If your breathing starts to match that patient rhythm, perfect. Inhale 4. Exhale 6. If you want more stories like this, soft myths, calm history, and nights that feel like a safe place to rest, consider subscribing, only if you enjoy this exact vibe. And if you're listening right now, tell me 2 things in the comments. Where you're listening from, and what time it is there, so this marsh can quietly remember you the next time we return to the water before the sun. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with Ra waking up. It begins with the world still dreaming, and 8 quiet forces standing in the dark, making room for morning without rushing it. Before you picture anything grand, before columns, before gold, before a sun that knows its schedule, let your mind drift toward a place that doesn't announce itself. A place that doesn't shout, "Here I am," the way later cities will, with their proud pylons and their tidy lines and their very confident right angles. This one begins in a softer geometry, marsh water, reeds, mud that remembers every footprint for a minute and then kindly forgets. The air is cool in that patient way it becomes just before dawn, when the world still feels unfinished, not because anything is wrong, but because nothing has rushed to be loud yet. Hermopolis, in this first imagining, isn't a postcard. It's not a destination. It's a listening place. You can almost feel it listening the way a closed room listens to a whisper, quiet, but attentive, as if the walls are collecting meaning. The ground is dark and damp, and the reeds are thin and steady, like little pens held upright, ready to write but not writing yet. Somewhere nearby, water slides past itself with no urgency. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't perform. It just moves low and slow, like a thought you haven't quite decided to have. If you step closer softly, because this place seems to prefer softness, you notice that even the sounds are careful. A frog call echoes once, then rests. A few insects click, then pause, as if they're waiting for permission. The marsh smells like wet earth and green stems, a smell that doesn't demand attention but stays with you anyway, the way the scent of paper stays on your fingers after you've turned a page. The sky above is not bright. It's a thick, velvety dark that doesn't feel threatening. It feels useful, like a blanket before you sleep, like the hush before a story begins. And it's strange in a gentle way how easily your mind accepts the idea that creation could start here. Not with a command, not with a trumpet, not with a dramatic announcement, but with this. Mud reads darkness and water that holds its shape without needing to prove anything. And later myths, later temples creation sometimes sounds like a decision. Like someone bangs a cosmic gavel and suddenly everything has to appear in neat categories. But in this Hermopolis mood, creation feels less like a decision and more like a slow stirring. Like breath fogging a mirror, not all at once, but gradually, patch by patch, until you realize the whole surface has changed. If you've ever watched condensation gather on a cool cup, how the first little droplets show up shyly, then more join them, then suddenly, the glass looks different without any single moment of, now it is done. That is the feeling here. The people of this place, priests, keepers, listeners, do not speak as if they're reporting breaking news. They speak the way someone speaks in a library, or the way you speak when you don't want to disturb a sleeping house. Their voices are low, not because they're afraid, but because loudness would feel rude, like clapping in a room where everyone is holding something fragile. They talk about an earlier time, earlier than names, earlier than this is that and that is this. An earlier time when nothing had a title and nothing needed one. There were no labels penned to the world like tags on a museum exhibit. There were only qualities, weights, sensations, darkness as a texture, water as a pressure, silence as a presence. You can imagine them sitting close to a small lamp, the flame carefully fed, the light warm but limited. It doesn't flood the space, it just makes a little island. Their hands move slowly as they gesture, as if fast gestures would scatter the ideas. You can picture reed pens laid aside, ink dark as a closed eye, papyrus waiting. And even if the papyrus is blank, the room feels full of the thought that the world begins not as a finished thing, but as a place of conditions. Hermopolis Camino, the city of 8, will become a famous name later, but right now it feels like the edge of a first night. Like you've arrived at the shoreline of darkness and you can see faintly that something is going to happen, but you don't need it to happen quickly. The night isn't a countdown here. It's an environment, it's a room you can sit in. It is the unseen space under the stars where the earliest forms can gather without being stared at. And if you listen closer than you usually listen, you can notice something almost funny in a very dry and ancient way. Humans, being humans, can't stop themselves from wanting to describe the indescribable. They can't help it. Give a person a mystery and they will immediately reach for a metaphor, like reaching for a blanket. So the priests talk about beginnings as if they're things you could touch, like mud. They talk about the pre-world as if it were a marsh in the mind of the universe, wet, shapeless, full of potential, waiting in a patient way. It's not a bad metaphor. It's actually a brilliant one because the marsh is both gentle and stubborn. It absorbs, it holds, it resists being neatly divided. It refuses to be a straight line. Water creeps into every gap. Plants grow where they feel like growing. The marsh doesn't care about your plans. It is almost as if it is reminding you that the earliest reality probably didn't care about plans either. Reality in its first form might have been more like a mood than a map. And in that mood, Hermopolis feels less like a city made of stone and more like a mine made of slow water. You can picture the temples before they became loud, before crowds, before the polished processions and the bright paint and the confident hymns. Early on, it's quieter. The structures are simpler. The sacredness is not in the decoration, but in the attention. The attention itself is the offering. To listen to water and darkness as if they matter, because in this theology, they do. Darkness is not evil here. It's a necessary condition. Water is not just a resource, it's a beginning state. And if you find that oddly comforting, you're not alone. There's something soothing about the idea that the world's first posture was calm. The marsh at Hermopolis doesn't look like a battlefield between good and evil. It looks like a place where reality is learning to hold its shape, the way a sleeping person learns to settle into one position and stop fidgeting. The reeds sway, then pause. The mud gives slightly under your weight, then steadies. A ripple spreads, then disappears. Everything practices being without any pressure to become spectacular. You may notice your own breathing matching it without you trying. Slow in, slow out. That's what this place does. It makes your body understand the myth before your mind even names it. And the priests, those careful speakers, keep returning to the same gentle point. There was a time when nothing had a name. Not because it was unknown, but because naming wasn't necessary yet. Names come later, when the world gets busy, when you need to tell one thing from another quickly. Names are like labels on jars in a pantry. Very helpful when the pantry is full. But at the start, the pantry is empty and the jars are all just jars, and the shelf is quiet and you can take your time. So the earliest reality is spoken of as qualities: coolness, depth, stillness, hiddenness, endlessness. The kind of words that describe a feeling more than an object. The kind of words you can't really point at, but you can recognize in your skin. If you think about it, this is a very human solution to a very impossible problem. How do you talk about the time before things? You do what humans always do. You describe it as a place, because places are easier. You can walk through a place. You can breathe in a place. You can imagine sitting down in a place and letting the world happen around you. So Hermopolis becomes that place in the imagination, the marsh at the edge of the first night, where creation is not a lightning strike, but a slow thickening of meaning. Sometimes, if you let your mind drift a little farther, you can almost see the way the story would be told in a half-whisper, as if the whisper itself is part of the ritual. The priest might say, very calmly, that in the beginning there was water, not the friendly water in a cup, not the tidy water in a canal, but endless water, dark water, water without shoreline. And he might pause, because pauses are powerful when you're not in a hurry. And then he might add, with the faintest hint of humor, that it's difficult to build anything when everything is wet. Which is true. Even the gods would have struggled with damp paperwork. It's a small joke, but it lands softly, like a reed bending. It doesn't break the mood, it makes it warmer. It reminds you that these stories were told by people who lived with floods and mud and mosquitoes and the daily reality of a river that could be generous or chaotic depending on its temperament. Their myth begins in water because their life began in water too, year after year, when the Nile rose and the land became temporarily not land, not yet, not stable, just potential. Hermopolis, then, is an idea shaped like a landscape. The landscape teaches the theology. Theology, in return, makes the landscape feel sacred. If you remain there, on the edge of the first night, you might notice how the darkness is not empty. It's full of invisible outlines. It's full of things not yet decided. In a normal day, we treat darkness as a lack of light, lack of vision, lack of information. Here, darkness feels more like a container, a storage room, a quiet archive. It holds what will be later, without exposing it too soon. That's a comforting thought if you're the kind of mind that likes to settle, because it means the unknown isn't a threat. It's a resting state. It's a sealed jar. It's a wrapped gift you don't need to open right now. And the water, always the water, keeps its slow discipline. It presses against the mud. It slips between reeds. It carries tiny bits of plant and silt the way a storyteller carries details, little pieces that make the scene believable. You can hear it if you're close enough. Not a roar, not a rush, but a quiet shifting. A sound like fabric moving, a sound like breath. It's easy in this calm to understand why creation is imagined as gradual. When you live with water, you know that water changes the world slowly but completely. A river doesn't argue, it persists. It erodes stone by being patient. It floods not with drama, but with inevitability. It leaves behind new soil without asking for applause. Water is the ultimate slow worker. If the universe had an employee of the month, water would win by simply showing up every day and reshaping everything. So the priests of Hermopolis speak as if the earliest work of creation is this kind of labor, steady, quiet, foundational, no shouting, no chaos as entertainment, just conditions gathering, deepening, balancing, a mood settling into a form. You might find yourself wanting a clearer picture, some definite shape, some definite character, something you can point to and say, ah, that's it. But Hermopolis is a place that teaches you to be okay without that. It teaches you that beginnings can be vague. In fact, beginnings might have to be vague because if everything appears too sharply too soon, it has nowhere to grow. So you stay with the marsh, you stay with the reeds. You stay with the first night, not as a scary curtain, but as a soft cloth laid over the world while it prepares itself. And you notice, perhaps with a small, sleepy smile, that this is exactly the kind of beginning a tired mind prefers. Not a bang. Not a demand. Just a slow, careful becoming, like your thoughts easing from sharp edges into softer shapes, like a room growing quieter as the last sounds settle. Hermopolis listens. The water listens. The mud listens. And if you let yourself match that gentleness, you can listen too, until the idea of before doesn't feel confusing anymore, only calm, only deep, only patiently waiting for something to take form. And when you're ready, you can let that listening water suggest the first quiet shapes it has been holding without names. If you stay in that listening marsh long enough, you start to notice something quietly practical about the way Hermopolis thinks. It doesn't begin with a cast of dramatic personalities. It begins with conditions like the world is a room being prepared. And the first thing you do is set the temperature, turn down the lights, and make sure the walls are actually there. And because human minds don't enjoy staring at raw abstraction for very long without fidgeting, those conditions are given faces. Not because the universe needs faces, but because people do. So the Ogdoad arrives 8 presences that are less like characters and more like the basic settings on reality. S control panel. The old storytellers aren't asking you to imagine 8 individuals with complicated backstories and favorite foods and strong opinions about pottery. They re-asking you to imagine 8 forces that have been gently person-shaped so you can remember them without straining. 8 ways of saying, before the world was a world, it was something like this. And there's an oddly soothing symmetry to it. 4 pairs. Always paired, balanced, like hands that match, like 2 sides of a jar, like a door that needs 2 hinges to open quietly. The myth doesn't let anything stand alone for too long. If there is a concept, it gets a partner. If there is a vastness, it gets a companion. Even the unformed has a kind of etiquette in Hermopolis. It comes in pairs, it comes in calm cooperation, it comes in a neat structure that feels strangely like the opposite of chaos, even though it's describing the time before order. You may have heard one of the most famous visual details, the male gods with frog heads, the female gods with serpent heads. It is one of those images that sticks in your mind the way a strange dream sticks, half whimsical, half ancient, and entirely uninterested in being normal. And you don't need to force it into a modern sense of why frogs, why snakes, as if the story owes you a footnote. In a marsh world, frogs are not exotic. They're the sound of water being alive. Frogs are the proof that dampness can produce motion. They appear, they multiply, they sing in the dark like tiny percussionists who never get tired. Serpents, meanwhile, are the opposite kind of living lying quiet, hidden, close to the ground, patient, able to vanish into reeds and return without warning. A serpent is a moving secret. It slides through places you can't quite see. In a world that begins in darkness and water and hiddenness, serpents feel appropriate, not as villains, not as threats, but as a symbol that reality can exist without being fully visible. So the Ogdoad are pictured like that. Marsh life and hidden life, croak and hush, surface and undercurrent. It's not meant to be a frightening image. It is meant to be an image that fits the environment, like choosing the right material for a bowl. Clay for a clay place, reeds for a reed place, frogs and serpents for a watery beginning. And still, the myth is careful. The point is not the heads, the point is what they represent. Each pair is a condition, a quality, a kind of pre-ingredient. If you want to feel the Ogdoad properly, you don't need to stare at them like statues. You need to notice them like weather. Imagine for a moment that you're not looking at a scene. You're inside a sensation. You re-standing in the pre-world the way you stand in a warm shower, except the shower is darkness, depth, stillness, and endlessness. Nothing is sharp yet. Nothing has corners. Nothing has decided what it will be. It's all soft potential, the way a blank page is full of writing that hasn't happened. That's the Ogdoad. Not 8 people doing things, but 8 how it feels states, arranged neatly so your mind can hold them without dropping them. And there's a mild humor hiding here. the sort that is so dry it's almost invisible. Humans cannot resist organizing even the unorganized. Even the formless gets filed. Even the pre-creation gets given an index. Somewhere in the background, you can almost imagine a priest with a very calm expression saying, "Yes, yes, it was unknowable and beyond language. But also, here are the 8 categories." It's comforting, really. It's like someone labeling jars in a pantry, not because the pantry demanded it, but because it's easier to live in a world where you can say, "That's the jar of endless water, and that's the jar of hiddenness, and please don't mix up the jar of darkness with the jar of infinity. They look similar in low light." The Ogdoad, then, are the ingredients of a dream before it becomes a morning. Not the story, yet just the atmosphere. Not the melody, just the quiet hum beneath it. They don't build with tools. They don't hammer anything into place. They simply exist, and their existence is what makes existence possible. It's very Hermopolitan, creation as a slow settling, not a loud command. When you picture them, try not to picture a dramatic gathering, as if 8 strange beings have scheduled a meeting and arrived on time. Picture something more subtle. Picture the marsh itself becoming aware of its own qualities. Water realizing it is deep. Darkness realizing it can hold things. Stillness realizing it can be a cradle. Hiddenness realizing it can be sacred. Infinity realizing it does not need a horizon. It is a quiet kind of theology, one that doesn't rush to separate everything into good and bad, hero and villain. In Hermopolis, darkness isn't evil. Water isn't just a hazard. Hiddenness isn't suspicious. Infinity isn't terrifying. These are simply conditions that must exist before anything else can exist. It is a worldview that feels strangely compatible with sleep. The idea that the most important work happens in the dark, in the unseen, in the slow background where nothing is being watched. And because the Ogdoad are not primarily about plot, they don't need to hurry. You can linger with them. You can let each concept settle in your body like a heavy blanket placed carefully, corner by corner, until you are covered. Darkness, for instance, in this Hermopolitan sense, is not a dramatic darkness. It's more like a closed eyelid. It's the gentle fact that you do not have to see everything at once. Darkness is permission not to know. It is the calm statement, "You may rest." It is the necessary cloth that keeps things from drying out too quickly, from hardening too soon, from being forced into shape prematurely. Hiddenness is similar but slightly different. Hiddenness is not missing. Hiddenness is veiled. It is the idea that some forces are present precisely because you can to point to them, like wind, like gravity, like the reason you feel calmer when the room is quiet. Hiddenness is what allows mystery to be gentle rather than frustrating. It tells you that the unseen is not empty, it's simply covered. And then there's water, not as a river you can navigate, but as the endless deep. Water here is not the cheerful water in a cup. It is the total environment. It is the beginning state. In a way, it's the myth saying, before there was anywhere to stand, there was only the feeling of being held by something that has no edges. Infinity, too, is not presented as a cosmic horror. It's presented as a calm, almost domestic concept. Infinity without a horizon, no final wall, no last number. It can sound dizzying if you stare at it too directly. The way you get dizzy if you look up at a night sky and try to count stars. But the myth softens it by pairing it, naming it, making it something you can carry mentally without dropping it. Infinity becomes a thing you can handle, like a heavy pot balanced carefully on the head steady, slow, not exciting, just held. And that's an important point. The Ogdoad are not there to thrill you. They're there to make the beginning of everything feel stable enough to imagine. They make the pre-world feel like a place you can sit in, not a void that pushes you away. They turn the unknown into something with texture and weight. They turn formlessness into a quiet room with 8 qualities arranged like cushions. It's also worth noticing softly. without turning it into a lecture that Hermopolis is doing something different than some other Egyptian creation traditions. Egypt had many local ways of describing beginnings, as if different cities held different angles of the same early dawn. Some traditions speak of a creator who speaks or shapes. Hermopolis leans into the idea that before any creator appears, there are conditions that make appearance possible. It's like saying, before the singer steps on stage, you need a stage, you need air, you need silence. You need the darkness that makes the first spotlight meaningful. So the Ogdoad are the stagehands of existence, not glamorous, not front and center, but absolutely necessary. And there's something delightfully boring about that, in the best way. They are cosmic infrastructure. The myth is telling you that reality begins the way a well-run household begins, with preparation, with someone quietly making sure the basics are in place before any big moment happens. You can almost picture the 8 forces not as creatures, but as layers. A layer of water, deep and endless. A layer of darkness, soft and honest. A layer of hiddenness, veiling the invisible work. A layer of infinity, stretching without complaint. And because they are paired, each layer feels balanced, not lonely. The pre-world is not a single concept floating by itself like a lost sock. It's a set of matched conditions, folded neatly. And perhaps that is why the Ogdoad can feel strangely calming. In a modern mind, before creation can sound like chaos, like nothingness, like a blank screen that refuses to load. Hermopolis offers a different mood. Before creation was not emptiness. It was fullness without form. It was a marsh at night, rich and damp, holding life in a slow pause. It was a dream, not yet translated into daylight. If you let your attention soften, you might even begin to feel the Ogdoad around you in small, ordinary ways. The darkness behind your eyelids, the hiddenness of your thoughts before you name them, the infinity of time when you stop checking it, the deep water feeling when you sink into a bed and the mattress holds you. It's almost as if Hermopolis is saying, you already know what the beginning feels like. You enter it every night when you fall asleep, when your mind returns to a place where shapes are not fixed yet, where everything is suggestion and atmosphere. The Ogdoad are the theology of that threshold, and the humor, again, stays gentle. Of course, humans would turn the soft, nameless conditions of pre-existence into a tidy set of 8. Of course we would. We would probably make it a nice chart if we had enough papyrus. We would probably argue politely about pronunciations. We would definitely have a favorite pair, even though the pairs do not care. We would say, I'm more of a deep water person, or I resonate with hiddenness, as if the cosmos were a personality quiz. But beneath that very human urge, there is a sincere calm. The Ogdoad are not there to be worshipped as celebrities. They're there to be recognized as the quiet truth. The world begins in conditions that do not need applause. The earliest reality is not a story. It is an atmosphere becoming ready for a story. So let the 8 presences remain what they are. Not 8 dramatic figures, but 8 gentle shapes of the unformed, paired like balanced hands, holding the pre-dawn world steady in its dark marsh mind until it feels natural to ask what those pairs exactly are. If you let your attention drift down from the reeds and the listening air, you eventually meet the oldest idea in this Hermopolis way of telling. Water that is not a river, not a canal, not a cup you can lift with one hand, but water as a total condition. Water as the original fact. Water as the thing you do not cross because it has no shore to step onto. This is none-endless deep water and non-it, its quiet partner, the same depth seen from another side, the same flood with a different kind of silence. The names themselves feel like they belong to the throat and the breath, as if you're meant to say them softly without disturbing the surface. None, non-it. They don't clatter, they don't sparkle, they settle, and that is already part of their meaning. This is not water that wants attention. This is water that simply is, and because it is, everything else must negotiate with it. When you imagine none in this Hermopolitan mood, try not to imagine a dramatic ocean with crashing waves, because crashing waves are a kind of personality. None has no need for personality. None is older than weather, older than wind, older than the first decision that could be called a decision. It is water without a horizon, water without a here and there. It is the idea that before anything had shape, the universe was something like being submerged in cool darkness, held in a pressure that is steady and patient, and Nana is the partner to that steadiness. If none is the endless flood as a fact, Nana is the endless flood as a presence. The myth pairs them because Hermopolis likes balance, and because there is something deeply calming about the idea that even the deepest, most unbounded condition has a companion. Nothing is alone, not even the pre-world, not even the dark water. It might help to think of Nan and Nonnet not as two separate pools, but as two ways of feeling the same depth. Like the way you can experience a room by sight and by sound, same room, different sense. None is the flood you could describe. Nonnet is the flood you would feel against your skin if you stood too close to it. The coolness that presses softly, the hush that makes your ears feel fuller. The sense that if you spoke too loudly, you might embarrass yourself in front of something ancient. Egypt begins with water in so many of its stories because Egypt lived with water in the most literal way. The Nile was not a background detail. It was a schedule, a boundary, a provider, a threat, a calendar, an argument, and a promise, sometimes all in the same month. Water was the cradle and the eraser. It could bring dark fertile soil, and it could remove your neat human plans with a single, unbothered rise. So when the myth says everything begins with water, it isn't trying to be poetic for poetry's sake. It is describing the most basic experience. The land appears when water retreats. The world becomes usable when the flood steps back. In Hermopolis, this everyday rhythm is lifted into the cosmic. Before the first mound of earth, before the first place to stand, there is none and nonnet, the deep that holds everything without giving you a surface. It's almost like the universe is waiting for a chair to exist, because without a chair, you're stuck standing forever, and standing forever is not a restful way to build reality. None and nonnet are the stage before the stage, the floor before the floor exists. And the myth does something quietly clever here. It refuses to treat water as purely comforting or purely frightening. Water is both. It is the first material, and it is the first obstacle. It is what you need and what you must overcome, not by fighting it, but by finding a way to stand within it. In a calm, sleepy way, this is a very mature theology. It's not interested in pretending the world is safe. It's interested in saying, the world begins in something that is bigger than you. That bigness can nourish you, and it can erase you. Both are true. You can hold both truths without panic, the way you can hold two stones in your hand and simply feel their weight. None and nonnet, then, are the weight of deep water weight, not as heaviness that hurts, but weight as the feeling that something is real. If you've ever floated in a pool and felt the water hold your body, how it supports you, how it surrounds you, how it removes the sharp insistence of gravity for a while, you have a small, gentle taste of what this myth is doing. But then imagine that sensation without edges, without walls, without ladders, without the reassuring knowledge that you can simply step out and dry your feet. That is the difference. None and nonnet are not a place you visit. They are the condition that precedes visiting. And because they are so vast, they don't do much in the way humans do. They don't run around with tools. They don't craft. They don't speak speeches. They exist, and their existence becomes the first material. The myth is almost blunt about this. There is no hammering in the beginning. There is only being. The first creative act is simply that something holds. If you picture them as a scene, keep it minimal. Imagine black water that doesn't reflect much because there's nothing bright yet to reflect. Imagine that the water is not chaotic, not stormy, but slow, thick, and quiet, like oil but not oily, like velvet but wet. Imagine the air above it is cool and still. There are no birds, no boats, no reeds, even not yet. Just the sense of depth stretching in all directions. A kind of infinite patience. And then, because Hermopolis loves turning concepts into sensations, the myth invites you to feel the water as pressure. Cool darkness pressing against skin. Not squeezing, not attacking, just being there, close, steady. The pressure is almost reassuring. It says you are contained, not by walls, but by a medium. You're held. The universe at this stage is less like a room and more like being wrapped in something that doesn't have seams. There's a soft irony too, that can make you smile without waking up. Humans who live in a desert-adjacent landscape, who spend so much time managing water, end up imagining the origin of everything as more water than anyone would ever want to manage. It's as if the cosmos began with the ultimate flood. No paperwork could survive it. No building project could start. No committee could schedule a meeting. In the beginning, the universe is essentially saying, we will start when we can find somewhere dry enough to put down our notes. But this isn't a complaint. It's a recognition. Water is the first truth because water is the first environment. And in that environment, the boundary between cradle and threat is thin. Like the line where the river meets the land, always shifting. If you stay with the image long enough, you may begin to understand why Nun and Nana are paired instead of left as a single force. Deep water is not just an object. It's a relationship. It is the relationship between what is held and what holds. Between the thing that could emerge and the medium it must emerge from. None can feel like the objective reality, the flood itself. None it can feel like the subjective reality, the flood as quiet companionship, as enveloping presence. Together, they make the pre-world feel less like a void and more like a womb dark, quiet, full of potential, but also full of the undeniable fact that potential is not yet a place to stand. This pairing also lets the myth do something else. It makes the beginning feel less lonely. Infinite water could be a cold idea if you imagine it as emptiness. But when the flood has a partner, the flood becomes a kind of conversation. Not a loud conversation, nothing in Hermopolis is loud if it can help it, but a mutual holding. Two sides of the same depth, mirroring each other. The universe, even before it has shapes, is already practicing balance. And this balance matters because the Ogdoad tradition is not telling you that the world begins with a single lonely creator shouting into nothingness. It is telling you that the world begins with conditions that exist together. Water is not alone. It is paired. Darkness is paired. Hiddenness is paired. Infinity is paired. Everything is in a calm, matched arrangement, like the world is being gently folded into shape rather than forced. So Nun and Nana are not merely water. They are the first pair you can almost feel physically. They explain why everything begins with water in Egypt. Yes, but they also explain a deeper idea, that existence begins as a sensation before it becomes a scene. Think of it this way. Before you can draw a picture, you need a surface. Before you can build a house, you need ground. Before you can write a name, you need a place to put the ink. Nun and Nana are the state where none of those surfaces exist yet. There's only the medium, only the deep, only the coolness and the pressure and the hush. It is not dramatic. It is foundational. And because it is foundational, it is strangely easy to let your mind drift with it. Water, especially deep water, does not ask you to focus sharply. It invites you to blur. It invites you to soften the edges of your thoughts. It invites your attention to float the way a reed floats upright, steady, gently moving with whatever slow current exists beneath. If you notice your own body while you think about Nun and Nonit, you might feel your shoulders sink a little. You might feel your jaw unclench. The myth is almost engineered for this effect. It doesn't demand that you follow a plot. It asks you to sit in a condition, and the condition is cool, dark, and steady. In this steadiness, there's also a quiet lesson that doesn't insist on being a lesson. Creation is not always a burst of action. Sometimes creation is the slow establishment of a state where action can happen later. Sometimes the most important work is the boring work of being a medium. The deep water does not rush. It does not try to become something else. It is content to be what it is, and in that contentment, it becomes the first support of everything. Now, if you want to picture the myth in the most Hermopolitan way, you can imagine Narrated as the feeling of standing at the edge of a great flood in the dark, not frightened, just quiet. You cannot see where the water ends because it doesn't end. The air is cool. The surface is almost still. You hear nothing but the small, soft movements of water adjusting itself, the tiniest laps, like breath. And you understand, in a calm, instinctive way, that any solid thing that will ever exist must find a way to emerge from this. But the myth does not ask you to worry about how. Worry is not part of this bedtime architecture. The myth simply holds you in the idea that the first reality is water, and water is both cradle and threat, and the deep is paired with its own quiet partner, so that even the oldest condition feels balanced. And once you've sat with that balance for a while, once you've felt the cool darkness pressing gently against your imagination, you can begin to sense how Narrated naturally lead your mind toward the other pairs, the other conditions, the other quiet names that help the pre-world become something you can finally stand on. After you've rested with Narrated, after you've let your mind float in the idea of endless deep water, you may notice something quietly missing. Not missing in a worrying way, just missing like a room that hasn't been fully described yet. Water is a beginning, yes, but water alone doesn't explain the feeling of how far or how much. Water gives you depth, but it doesn't automatically give you the sense of space stretching on and on without a boundary. It doesn't explain the strange, calm terror of realizing there is no final wall, no last step, no polite little fence where reality stops and says, "That's enough for today." So Hermopolis introduces another pair, Hey and Howit, and with them comes a different kind of vastness. Not wet vastness, not dark vastness, but sheer measurelessness, infinity without a horizon. Their names feel like they belong to something breathy, something that is exhaled rather than spoken. Hey, Howit. There's a softness in the sound, as if the myth is trying very carefully not to startle you, while it hands you an idea that could easily become dizzying. Because infinity can be dizzying, especially when you stare at it too directly, like looking down from a great height when you didn't realize you were standing near an edge. But Hermopolis doesn't want you to panic. It wants you to understand why infinity needs to be part of the beginning. It wants you to feel it gently as something the cosmos requires, like a room needs walls, but also needs the space inside the walls to actually exist. Hey and Hellhead are the idea that there is no edge, no final wall, no last number to count. They're not about a particular place. They're about the fact that place can extend. They're about the and then that never runs out. And because the human mind is a creature that likes endings, likes the neat click of a drawer closing, likes the satisfying final dot at the end of a sentence, this idea is not naturally comfortable. Infinity doesn't give you closure. It gives you openness. And openness, if you're too awake, can feel like standing in a hallway that keeps lengthening. So the myth does something kind. It turns infinity into a pair you can name. That is one of the quiet genius moves of the Ogdoad. It takes enormous, non-human conditions and makes them holdable. Not small, not tame, but holdable like giving you a heavy object with handles so you don't have to hug it awkwardly and drop it on your foot. Infinity is too big for the arms of thought, so Hermopolis gives it handles, He and Howit. 2 names, 2 faces, 1 vast condition, now made slightly more manageable simply because you can point to it without losing your balance. And it's worth noticing how different this infinity is from the deep water of none and none. None is endless in the sense that it fills everything. It is the medium. Hey is endless in the sense that everything has room to exist. None is the what you're in. Hey is the how far it can go. None makes existence possible as substance. Hey makes existence possible as space. If you want to picture hey and how it's in a way that stays sleepy, imagine the feeling you get when you look up at a night sky. Not the night sky in a city where the lights make everything feel politely contained, but a truly dark sky where the stars are many and the darkness between them feels deeper than your thoughts. You look up and your mind does its usual human trick. It tries to measure. It tries to estimate. It tries to find a boundary. And when it can't, it does a little wobble, like a person taking one step too far in a staircase. That wobble is the first taste of ha, but in the Hermopolitan telling, that wobble isn't meant to become fear. It's meant to become all that is calm. The myth says, yes, infinity can be dizzying at first. So we will give you a pair, a partnership, a balance, so you can carry the idea as calmly as a heavy pot balanced on the head. That image heavy pot on the head is a very Egyptian sort of calm practicality. It's not mystical in a flashy way, it's domestic. It's everyday. It's the kind of image that says, even if something is heavy, you can carry it if you learn the right posture. Infinity becomes that kind of burden, not crushing, just requiring steadiness. So hey and Hauter are not there to be dramatic. They are there to make the cosmos feel huge enough to hold gods, humans, and time without cracking. That last detail matters because a universe that is too small is a fragile universe. If everything is cramped, it rubs, it collides, it overheats. If there isn't enough room, nothing can unfold. Infinity in this theology is not a luxury. It is structural. It is the quiet engineering that prevents reality from snapping like a clay pot fired too quickly. And in a sleepy way, that's a comforting thought. The world isn't just thrown together, it is given room. It is given a gentle spaciousness so that things can happen slowly, without pressure. If you imagine the Ogdoad as a set of conditions preparing a dawn, Het and Hawit are the part that makes the dawn possible by giving it somewhere to spread. Before light rises, there must be a place for light to rise into. Before any shape can appear, there must be a space where shape can have edges. Infinity is the large blank cloth on which the first patterns can be woven. Without cloth, the weaving has nowhere to sit. Without space, the world cannot become a world. Now, because Hermopolis is always slightly amused by the human urge to name everything, there's also a soft irony in this pair. Infinity, by definition, does not fit into a definition. It does not fit into a jar. It does not fit into a list. And yet here it is, politely put into a pair, given names, given a place in the sequence. It is like trying to label all possible numbers, and then acting as if the label has solved the problem. But the myth isn't naive. It knows the label doesn't reduce infinity. It just makes it possible for the mind to approach infinity without falling asleep from sheer conceptual exhaustion, or, on the other end, without getting too excited and waking itself up. So Hey and Hawit are a bedtime-friendly infinity. Not a philosophical debate, not an argument about mathematics. Just a soft presence that says there is no edge and you do not need to find one. And that last part, you do not need to find one, is where this pair becomes deeply compatible with sleep. A restless mind often tries to find edges. It tries to complete loops. It tries to finish thoughts. It wants the last sentence. Infinity interrupts that urge in a strangely soothing way. It says, there's no last sentence, and that is fine. You can stop trying. You can stop reaching for the end. In the Hermopolitan mood, infinity becomes permission to drift. If you picture Hey and Hawit as beings, The traditional imagery sometimes shows them associated with boundlessness, sometimes with the idea of millions, and there are artistic ways of indicating vast time and vast space, but you don't need a museum in your head right now. You can keep it simple. Imagine two calm presences standing not in a landscape, but in an absence of borders. They are not rulers. They are not judges. They do not point or command. They simply mark that reality has room, like invisible pillars holding up a ceiling so high you forget it's there. And because they are a pair, you can imagine them as two matching supports, like two posts that keep a doorway wide enough for everything to pass through. Not narrow, not tight, wide, spacious, unrushed. Hey and Howitt are the wide of the universe. This width matters in another quiet way. It makes time possible. You can't have time unfolding if there is no room for unfolding. You can't have sequences if there is no spaciousness for sequences to stretch. So infinity is not only about distance, it's also about duration. Even if the Hermopolitan telling doesn't force you into a strict separation between space and time, you can feel the sense of enoughness, enough room, enough continuity, enough capacity. Enough and then to allow the world to become layered. And layered is what Egypt loves. Layers of story, layers of symbol, layers of river silt settling year after year, layers of paint on temple walls, layers of meaning stacked gently until they become a thick, quiet civilization. A layered world needs room to layer. Hey and Howitt provide that room. Sometimes, if you let yourself play with the idea in a very soft, sleepy way, you can think of Hey and Hauta as the background against which all boundaries become meaningful. A boundary only matters because it is placed inside something that could have continued. A shoreline is significant because water could have kept going. A wall is significant because space could have kept extending. A name is significant because it draws a circle around something that could have been left unnamed. Infinity, then, is the invisible more that makes this possible. And this is where the mythology becomes almost tender. It treats infinity not as something that threatens the human mind, but as something that carries it. Infinity is the large, quiet cushion under everything. It's the mattress of the cosmos. You lie on it without thinking about it. You trust it without needing to see its edges. If you've ever fallen asleep while thinking, I'll just rest my eyes for a second, and then hours pass without you noticing, you've tasted a small version of what Hey and Howitt represent. Time without a sharp boundary, adrift without a clear, now this is the end. Sleep itself is a kind of friendly infinity, at least from the inside. It doesn't announce transitions. It simply moves you along. Hey and Howitt feel like that. Not a tunnel, not a cliff, but a wide space you can float in until you stop trying to measure it. And yes, if you are too awake, you might want to ask, how can the mind tolerate infinity? How can anyone live with the idea of no end? The Hermopolitan answer is beautifully simple. You don't tolerate it by staring at it. You tolerate it by naming it gently and then moving on. You make it a pair, you place it among other pairs, and you let it become part of the background. You let it be the silent support rather than the main focus. So in this Ogdoad sequence, He and Howitt are like the quiet expansion of the room. You might not even notice it happening. You just find that the ceiling is higher than you expected, the walls farther apart, the air more open. You find that reality feels less cramped. There is space for gods to appear later, yes, but also space for ordinary things. Reeds to sway, water to breathe, small animals to live without bumping into the edge of existence. And that is a strangely gentle thought. The universe begins not only with substance, but with spaciousness. Not only with deep water, but with room. So let Hey and Howitt remain what they are. The calm fact that there's no final wall. No last number, no horizon where the cosmos stops. Let that fact be less of a question and more of a soft background wide enough to hold every quiet condition that comes before dawn. and wide enough to let your thoughts loosen their grip and simply drift. After deep water, after endlessness, there's a moment where your mind expects a rule to arrive, something simple and loud, like a signpost. Something like, light is good, darkness is bad. It's the kind of rule people carry without noticing, the way you carry keys in your pocket and only remember them when you reach a door. And in the Hermopolis way of telling, that signpost never appears. Instead, you get a softer instruction written in a quieter ink. Darkness is not a villain here. Darkness is not a mistake. Darkness is an ingredient. This is where Kek and Kauket enter, not as dramatic figures stepping onto a stage, but as the atmosphere that was already present, now given names so your human memory can keep hold of it without squeezing too hard. Kek and Kauket are the honest truth that night exists before light, and that the first night is not an emergency. It is a working condition. It is the world's earliest shelter. If you've ever been awake in a room where someone suddenly turns on a bright ceiling light, you know how the body reacts before the mind has time to complain. The shoulders tense, the eyelids blink. The whole nervous system says, in a very ancient language, too much. And if you've ever done the opposite, dimmed a lamp, lowered a screen, let the room fall into a soft darkness, you know the reverse language too. Okay, we can rest here. Kek and Kauket feel closer to that second language. They feel like the universe learning to dim itself on purpose, not out of fear, but out of care. In the Hermopolitan imagination, darkness is treated like cloth. Not a frightening void, not a hungry emptiness, but a fabric draped over the beginning so the beginning can stay moist, patient, uncracked. You can imagine it as a cool covering laid gently over a bowl of water to keep it from evaporating. You can imagine it as a curtain drawn in a room where something delicate is being arranged. Darkness becomes privacy. Darkness becomes protection from premature attention. Because attention can be rough. Even gentle attention can be rough if it arrives too early. So Kek and Kauket are like keepers of the first quiet. They're not there to chase anyone away with a spear, the way mythological guardians sometimes do when they want a plot to happen. They are there to preserve a mood. Hush. The hush that lets forms gather slowly, like dust motes gathering in a beam of light, except here there isn't a beam yet. So the dust motes can gather without being seen, without being forced to explain themselves. That's a strangely comforting version of darkness. Not the darkness of threats, but the darkness of incubation. It also fits the landscape logic that Hermopolis keeps returning to. In marshland, darkness doesn't erase the world, it softens it. Reeds don't vanish at night, their outlines simply become gentler. Water doesn't stop existing, it just stops showing off. The air cools, sounds become more distinct because the rest of the world is quieter. A frog call feels like it has more room. An insect's small click becomes noticeable, not because it's loud, but because the background has stepped back. Kek and Kauket are that stepping back, and it matters that the myth calls them darkness, not death, not destruction, not punishment. Just darkness, a condition, a setting. Something like the night mode of reality, but far older and far more patient than anything a modern phone could imitate. If anything, the phone is the child copying the ancient pattern. Dim the lights, reduce the noise, let the mind settle. Do the quiet work in the background. There is a dry little humor hiding inside this if you look at it sideways. Humans are always slightly suspicious of darkness. We invent lamps, and then invent brighter lamps, and then invent lights that can be seen from space, and then act surprised when we can't see stars. We treat darkness like a glitch in the system, when for the Hermopolitan storyteller, darkness is the system's first stable setting. Kek and Kauket would probably watch a modern city at night bright as a festival, humming, buzzing, refusing to be quiet and think politely. This seems tiring, but the point isn't to judge. The point is to reframe. Kek and Kauket teach you to stop moralizing the night. because moralizing the night makes it hard to rest in it. In many stories, darkness is used as a shortcut. It's a simple cue: get afraid, tighten your grip, prepare for trouble. Hermopolis refuses shortcuts. It makes you sit with the idea that the earliest reality was dark because there was no light yet, and that's all. The darkness is not a character flaw. It's the first environment. It's what you get before you get everything else. And when you accept that slowly, as if accepting it too quickly might be suspicious, you realize how much calmer the beginning becomes. You don't need a battle between light and dark. You don't need a cosmic argument. You don't need an enemy. You just need conditions: water, endlessness, darkness, hiddenness. Kek and Kauket are the darkest portion of the recipe, and the recipe is not trying to frighten you. It's trying to be accurate in a mythic way. Night comes first, dawn comes later. That order is not dramatic, it's normal. Now, if you want to feel Kek and Kauket properly, it helps to avoid the word black as a color, and instead treat darkness as a sensation. Darkness can feel thick, like velvet. It can feel cool, like stone that has been sitting in shade. It can feel quiet, like a room with a closed door. In the Hermopolitan telling, darkness is almost tactile. It presses softly, not in a way that traps you, but in a way that holds you steady. It's the difference between standing in a wide open field under harsh midday sun, every edge exposed, every detail demanded, and standing under a night sky where your eyes stop, trying to catalog everything, and your mind finally loosens its grip. Kek and Kauket are the loosening, and they are paired because in Hermopolis nothing important is left alone. Even darkness gets companionship. That pairing is part of what makes it feel safe. Loneliness can turn a room into something eerie. Company turns a room into a home. Kek and Kauket are the home version of darkness. The darkness of a sleeping house, not the darkness of an abandoned one. Picture a small temple room before dawn. The stone is cool. The air is still. The only light is a low lamp, not bright enough to conquer the shadows, only bright enough to make a warm island in the center. The shadows remain around the edges, not as threats, but as boundaries that keep the world from feeling too exposed. The lamp doesn't declare war on the dark. It coexists with it. That coexistence is the Hermopolitan mood. Darkness is not an opponent. It's a partner that makes light meaningful, because light needs darkness to be noticed. If everything is equally bright, brightness becomes ordinary. It becomes noise. Darkness is what makes the first glimmer feel like something. Kek and Kauket are the guardians of that contrast, but they guard it quietly, the way a librarian guards silence, not by fighting, but by maintaining a tone. There's also something honest about them. Darkness is the simplest truth. You cannot see everything. Even when the world is fully formed, you cannot see everything. You can't see behind walls. You can't see into other minds. You can't see into tomorrow. Darkness, in the steeper sense, is the universe's way of saying mystery is normal. You're not supposed to have every detail all the time. Kek and Kauket represent that normal mystery, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a condition to live inside. That's why they can be called keepers rather than enemies. They keep the unseen space under the stars, the unseen room where forms can begin to gather. In Hermopolis, darkness is treated like a necessary storage room. You don't throw away storage rooms just because they're not bright. You need somewhere to put things while they're not ready to be displayed. And the world at the beginning is not ready to be displayed, so the darkness keeps it from being displayed too early. This is where the myth starts to feel quietly aligned with sleep itself, because sleep is, in a way, your personal nightly return to the unformed. When you sleep, your mind loosens its names. Shapes blur, stories become atmospheres. You stop insisting on sharp edges. You drift into the kind of internal darkness that isn't evil at all, just private, just necessary, just restorative. Kek and Kauket are like the cosmic version of that private darkness. the place where the brain of the universe rests before it opens its eyes. And once you see it that way, the fear of darkness starts to look a little like a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that is very human, very common, and not shameful, but still a misunderstanding. Darkness is not automatically danger. It is a condition where danger could be hidden, yes, but it is also a condition where tenderness can be protected. Darkness is where seeds sprout. Darkness is where clay stays workable. Darkness is where ink dries slowly without cracking the papyrus. Darkness is where water halts its coolness. If you want a small, cozy example, think of bread dough. If you leave it out under harsh light and dry air, it crusts too soon. It resists its own rise. If you cover it with cloth and let it sit, it becomes soft and alive. Kek and Kauket are the cloth. The universe's first dough needs to rise in covered quiet, not because it is ashamed, but because it needs time without being stared at. That's the crucial part. Darkness is time. Darkness is permission. Darkness is patience made into an environment. And in a culture that watched dawn arrive every day across a river valley, dawn wasn't a victory in a war. Dawn was simply the next phase of a cycle. Night wasn't defeated. Night completed its work and stepped aside. Kek and Kauket represent the night phase as sacred because it is effective. It is the phase in which unseen things organize themselves. So you can imagine them as the black water under the stars, the unseen room where forms can begin to gather. That phrase matters. Begin to gather, not begin to fight, not begin to conquer. Just gather. Like people arriving quietly at a meeting that doesn't need to be announced with trumpets. Like clouds gathering, not to threaten, but to hold moisture. Like a thought gathering itself into a sentence you don't have to rush. And you can feel how the myth's tempo is different because of this. It slows down. It becomes more breathable. It becomes a SMR friendly almost by accident because its cosmology is based on slow preparation rather than sudden action. Kek and Kauket's darkness is also described as not evil because evil as a concept needs a formed world to exist inside. Evil implies choices, motives, conflicts, consequences. In the unformed beginning, you don't have those categories yet. You have conditions. Darkness is simply one of them. It would be like calling winter evil because it's cold. Winter is not evil. It's a season. Kek and Kauket are that seasonality applied to the cosmos. Darkness is a season of the beginning. So if you find your mind trying to tense, trying to anticipate danger because the word darkness appears, you can let Kek and Kauket undo that reflex. You can let them remind your body that darkness can be a blanket rather than a threat. A blanket is also darkness in a small way. It blocks light. It hides your hands. It changes the world into a softer shape. And we trust it because we know what it's for. Kek and Kauket are what darkness is for. They guard the world's first quiet. That guard here should be read in the gentlest sense, like a nurse in a dim room at night. The nurse isn't fighting anything. The nurse is making sure the environment stays calm so healing can happen. Kek and Kauket are the dim room where the universe heals from not yet being a universe. It's also worth sitting with the idea that darkness is necessary for holding. The myth says, without it, nothing can be held long enough to shape. In practical terms, bright heat dries and hardens. Light exposes, exposure rushes, darkness cools. Darkness protects. Darkness keeps the moisture of possibility. You can feel this even in your own habits. When you're trying to think of something delicate like remembering a dream or finding the right word, too much pressure can make it vanish. The more you stare at it, the more it slips away. But if you soften your gaze, it returns. Darkness is like softened gaze on a cosmic scale. It keeps the delicate beginnings from fleeing. So you can imagine Kek and Kauket as the universe's softened gaze, a gaze that does not demand performance. And that brings in another tiny, dry, modern analogy that stays quiet if you let it. Darkness is the universe turning off notifications. Brightness is a ping. Brightness is a demand. Darkness is the do not disturb setting. Kek and Kauke are the keepers of do not disturb. The beginning needs it. Without it, everything would be interrupted before it could settle into itself. Now, to stay close to the Hermopolis marsh mood, let your imagination return to reeds and water. The darkness there is not theatrical. It's damp and cool. The reeds become silhouettes, like ink strokes on a page. The water becomes a low, breathing surface. The sky becomes a deep roof. And within that deep roof, the unseen room gathers. You can sense forms as potential, not as threats. You can sense that the world is quietly arranging itself in the dark like someone tidying a room, without turning on the lights because they already know where everything is. Kek and Kauke are that quiet tidying. And notice how this kind of darkness encourages a different style of humor, soft, not disruptive. You can almost imagine an ancient storyteller saying, yes, yes, you want to see everything. But the universe at this stage would prefer you not to hover it as the same gentle irritation you feel when someone stands behind you while you retrying to do something careful. Darkness is the polite way the cosmos asks for space. So the darkness isn't evil, it's boundaries, it's privacy. It's the condition that lets other conditions work properly. It's the unseen room under the stars where the first forms gather. The keepers of that room are Kek and Kauke, paired and steady, not pushing anyone into fear, only keeping the hush intact. If you sit with them long enough, you may also realize how much of your own calm comes from darkness. Most people sleep better in a dim room. Most people relax when the lights are softer. The body understands this without argument. The body knows that bright light means be alert, and low light means you can let go. Hermopolis is simply scaling that body knowledge up into a creation myth. The cosmos begins in the mode that allows letting go, and letting go is what you need if you want to drift. So let Kek and Kauke remain a simple truth rather than a spooky one. Night exists before day, and night is not a monster. Night is a keeper. Night is a necessary cloth. Night is the calm background that holds the first shaping long enough for it to become stable. And if you allow yourself to trust that, even for a few breaths, darkness stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like a gentle presence, quietly prepared to make room for whatever remains unseen, veiled, and patiently waiting. After you've sat with deep water, and after you've let your mind stretch into infinity, and after you've accepted a darkness that isn't evil, there is still one more quiet condition that Hermopolis treats with unusual respect: the hidden. Not the lost, not the missing, not the we misplaced it and it will turn up later behind the jar of common. Hiddenness in the Hermopolitan mood is something else entirely. Hiddenness is presence that chooses not to stand under a spotlight. This is where Amun and Amonit settle into the story, not with a loud entrance, not with a bright emblem, but with the calm certainty of something that works best when it isn't stared at. Amun and Amonit represent what cannot be seen directly, the concealed force behind the visible world. If Nun and Nonit feel like the deep water you can sense pressing around everything, and He and Howit feel like the wide space that lets everything have room, and Kek and Kauke feel like the dark cloth that shelters the first quiet, then Amun and Amonit feel like the hand behind the curtain. The hand doesn't need applause. The hand just needs to do its job. Hiddenness becomes sacred in this telling for a very simple reason. Creation feels mysterious even after it happens. Even when you can point at a reed and say, reed, even when you can point at land and say, land. The question remains, why is there something rather than nothing? And how did the something decide to behave so consistently? Hermopolis doesn't answer that question by shouting. It answers by nodding gently toward the veil. The hidden is not absent. It is veiled. That line is worth letting settle because it changes how you imagine the unseen. Absent feels empty, like a cupboard with nothing in it. Veiled feels full, like a cupboard with a closed door. The door isn't proof of emptiness. It's proof of containment. Amun and Amonit are that containment. They are the principle that reality can have a backbone you cannot point to, a support structure that stays politely out of view. And if you think about your own life quietly, without turning this into a motivational talk, you already know what that means. The strongest things in a building are rarely the decorative things. The decorative things are lovely, but they're optional. The hidden beams are not optional. The plumbing is not glamorous, but it is devoted. The wiring does not demand attention, but it keeps the room from becoming awkwardly useless at night. In a very calm, almost boring way, the world runs on hidden systems. Amun and Amonit are the mythic way of saying, yes, exactly. The universe, too, has its hidden systems. In Hermopolis, hiddenness is treated almost like a kind of power that doesn't need to prove itself. It's power as steadiness, power as refusal to perform. The hidden force does not posture, it does not announce. It simply holds the world from behind, the way a spine holds a body from inside. And the myth makes this feel gentle by using imagery that is domestic and close. The hidden is like a face behind linen and lamplight. That's not a threatening image. It's a soft one. Linen is a familiar material in Egypt, clean, light, folded carefully, used for bodies and rituals in everyday life. Lamplight is warm and small. So the image is not of a terrifying mystery. It's of a mystery that is present nearby and calmly covered. Imagine a room with a single lamp. The lamp's light doesn't reach every corner. It makes a circle of warmth, and beyond that circle, the room still exists, but it's softened. Now imagine a linen curtain hanging in that lamplight. You can see the curve of something behind it, a suggestion of a shape, a presence without detail. The shape is not absent. It's simply not fully revealed. You don't need to tear the linen down to prove the shape is there. You can accept it. The acceptance is part of the calm. Amun and Amonit ask for that kind of acceptance. And there is a quiet irony in the fact that humans love to name what cannot be seen. We do it constantly. We name the wind by the way it sounds in trees. We name feelings we can't measure. We name time, even though no one has ever held time in a bowl. Naming is our way of making the invisible sit still long enough for us to feel less dizzy. So Hermopolis gives hiddenness a pair of names, and in doing so it doesn't dissolve the mystery, but it makes the mystery livable. It makes the mystery something you can set beside you without it keeping you awake. Amun and Amonit are not there to give you a bright answer. They are there to give you a soft framework. Some forces are meant to remain veiled because the veil itself is part of how reality stays stable. Too much exposure dries things out. Too much direct light can be harsh. Some beginnings require dimness. Some workings require privacy. That is why hiddenness becomes sacred. Sacredness, in this sense, is not about fear. It's about respect. You don't poke at everything. You don't demand everything reveal itself on your schedule. You let some things remain covered, not because you're powerless, but because you understand that covering can be functional. Hermopolis, in its slow and careful mood, treats hiddenness as functional. And this is a very Egyptian kind of practicality in mythic clothing. Egyptian temples often had inner spaces, quiet places within quiet places, where not everyone went, where not everything was visible. The idea of a sacred inner room isn't only spiritual, it's architectural. The outer courtyards are bright, the inner chambers are dim. The farther in you go, the less light you have, and the more your senses shift from sight to feeling. The world becomes less about what you see and more about what you sense. Hiddenness is not a failure of lighting. It is a design choice. Amun and Amonit feel like the divine version of the inner chamber, the deepest part of reality that remains veiled so that the surface can remain coherent. If Nun is the deep water and Kik is the deep night, Amun is the deep behind both. He is the idea that beneath the visible, beneath the describable, There is a concealed force that makes the visible possible. The myth does not ask you to picture a strongman god flexing in the dark. It asks you to picture a presence that is powerful precisely because it does not need to show itself. Hiddenness is not weakness here. Hiddenness is stability. And you can feel how this prepares you for the feeling of dawn without turning dawn into a battle. In many stories, the sun rises like a hero arriving, like a triumphant entrance. Hermopolis makes dawn feel more like a slow unveiling. A sun that will rise from somewhere you cannot point to. That phrase matters. You cannot point to it because the source is hidden. The origin is veiled, yet the result will be visible. The world will light up, but the deepest cause remains quietly behind a curtain. That is hiddenness as power, the ability to act without needing to be seen. It's almost soothingly boring in the best way, because it's how many real things work. You don't see your heartbeat. You see what your heartbeat allows you to do. You don't see your thoughts forming in the back of the mind. You notice the sentence when it arrives. You don't see the roots of a plant working. You notice the green above ground. And if you've ever been around someone who is truly competent quietly, almost annoyingly competent, you know, the kind of power that doesn't advertise itself, it just handles things. Amen and Amonit are that kind of competence on a cosmic scale. They handle hiddenness. Now, the Hermopolitan map places them in a sequence, which means they are part of a gentle logic. Hiddenness comes after darkness in this flow because darkness provides cover, and hiddenness provides the principle that something can be present under cover. Darkness is the room with the lights off. Hiddenness is the thing in the room that exists without needing the lights on. Darkness is the environment. Hiddenness is the quality of what works inside that environment. So Amen and Amonit don't fight the dark. They belong to it, not as villains, not as predators, but as veiled presence. If Kek and Kaukit are the honest truth that night exists before light, Amen and Amonit are the honest truth that some forces remain unseen even after light arrives. Light does not abolish the hidden. It simply changes what you can notice. And there is a calm lesson here that does not insist on being a lesson. Not everything that matters will be visible. Not everything that matters will announce itself. If you want a stable world, if you want a world where things don't and constantly collapse into chaos, you need hidden structures. You need veiled workings. You need the kind of power that doesn't shout. Hermopolis is quietly pro-backstage. Think of a theater, but don't make it dramatic. Make it sleepy. Imagine a stage with a calm set, a simple backdrop, a few props, nothing flashy. The audience sees the scene and thinks, ah, yes, a world. But the world is held by things the audience doesn't watch. Ropes, pulleys, stagehands moving carefully, timing cues, small adjustments. If the audience stared at the backstage the entire time, the play would feel less like a world and more like a list of mechanics. Backstage is hidden so the stage can be believed. Amen and Amonit are the backstage of existence. Hidden so the visible can feel natural. And if that analogy feels too lively, you can soften it further. Think of a loom. The pattern you see is only possible because of threads you don't focus on. Think of a woven linen cloth. Egypt loved linen after all. When you look at linen, you see a smooth surface, but it is made of threads crossing in a structure. You don't stare at each thread, you accept the cloth. The threads do not demand attention, they simply hold. Hiddenness is the thread structure. This is why the myth says hiddenness becomes sacred. It is not a flaw. It is a method. It is the method by which the unformed becomes capable of forming without being torn apart by attention. Some parts of reality must remain veiled so the rest of reality can become stable enough to hold names. And Hermopolis is obsessed in a calm way with the moment before names. It likes the feeling of before, because before is gentle. Before has no deadlines. Before does not require performance. Hiddenness belongs to before, because hiddenness allows before to remain intact long enough for the world to settle. If you picture Amun and Amonit as presences, picture them as subtle shifts rather than statues. Picture the feeling that something is there even when you can't see it, like warmth from embers after a fire has dimmed, like the smell of incense lingering after the smoke has thinned, like the pressure change before rain. None of these are visible in a sharp way, but they are real. You can't point to them, yet they shape your experience. Amun and Amonit are that kind of shaping. And because the tone here is meant to stay sleepy, the myth doesn't ask you to solve the hidden. It asks you to accept it as a calm boundary. Acceptance is restful, solving is stimulating. Hermopolis chooses rest. So you can let your mind stop clawing for a bright explanation. You can let it be enough that the myth says the hidden is present and its presence is powerful. There's also something gentle in the idea that creation remains mysterious even after it happens. Many people want creation to be a single moment you can diagram. Hermopolis treats creation more like a process that leaves its deepest steps behind a curtain. You can watch the world emerge, but you can't stand at the exact point where emergence becomes inevitability. That point is veiled. It is hiddenness. It is Amun and Amonit. And if you find that frustrating, you can soften it into something almost cozy. Some recipes are better when you don't overthink them. The bread rises because it rises. You can learn the conditions, you can respect the process, but the exact moment where dough becomes ready is a felt thing, not a mathematical proof. It's the same with dawn in this myth. You can feel it approaching, but you can't point at the exact place it begins. The beginning is hidden. Hiddenness then becomes the gentlest kind of mystery, the kind that doesn't demand your attention. It's a mystery you can live beside, like a quiet neighbor. The neighbor doesn't knock on your door at midnight to announce, "I am mysterious." The neighbor simply exists, and you are free to ignore them until you're ready to notice. Amun and Amonit are that neighborly mystery. And because the Ogdoad works in pairs, hiddenness is paired too, balanced. The hidden is not a single lonely force lurking in the corner of the myth. It has a partner. It has symmetry. It has steadiness. Hermopolis refuses to let the unseen become frightening by leaving it isolated. Isolation breeds unease. Pairing breeds calm. So the hidden is treated as a sacred veil rather than a suspicious shadow. You can feel how different this is from stories that treat hiddenness as deceit. In Hermopolis, hiddenness is not deception. It is not someone hiding something to trick you. It is concealment as a natural state, the way seeds are concealed in soil, the way roots work without display, the way the deep water remains deep even when the surface is calm. Hiddenness is not a moral issue here. It is a structural feature of reality. And that is a relief, because moral issues wake the mind up. Structural features lull the mind to sleep. The mind can accept structure without arguing. The mind can relax into the idea that some things are veiled, because that is how the world is built. If you stay in the Hermopolis marsh for a moment still in your imagination, still slow, you can almost sense Amun and Amonit as the part of the night that feels like a presence rather than an absence. The reeds move, and you don't fully see why, but you know there's wind. The water shifts, and you don't see the current, but you know it exists. The air cools, and you don't see the coolness, but your skin registers it. The hidden is everywhere, quietly making the visible behave. This is the concealed force behind the visible world. And because it is concealed, it doesn't provoke you into chasing it. Chasing is not the goal. The goal is to let the veil be a veil. To let the face behind linen remain softly outlined without demanding detail. To let the unseen room remain unseen, because the unseen room is where the earliest preparations can continue without being interrupted. In that calm acceptance, you may notice your own thoughts behaving differently. They become less sharp. They become more like impressions. The need to pin everything down loosens. You start to feel comfortable with, I can't point to it, but it's there. That comfort is exactly what Amun and Amonit represent. It is hiddenness as power and also hiddenness as permission. So let the hidden be sacred in the simplest sense, respected, not feared. Let it be the quiet veil that keeps the mystery gentle. Let Amin and Amonit remain close but ungrasped, like warmth behind cloth, like a presence behind linen and lamplight steady, veiled, and calm enough that you don't have to solve it to drift alongside it. After water, after endlessness, after darkness, after hiddenness, after all those quiet conditions have been allowed to sit together without rushing, something begins to happen that is almost disappointing in its lack of drama. Not disappointing in a bad way. Disappointing in the way a calm person might disappoint you by not panicking. The myth does not give you thunder. It does not give you a shout. It gives you a slow, patient emergence, a first solid place, a mound above the flood, appearing as if the universe has finally decided it would be nice to have somewhere to put its feet. And feet is a very human word for this moment, but it helps, because the feeling of standing matters. Until there is a surface, everything is concept, everything is condition, everything is atmosphere. The first mound is not just a piece of land. It is the first permission to stand still. Imagine the black water of Nile not as an ocean with waves, but as a quiet expanse with no shoreline water that does not crash because there is nothing for it to crash against. The surface is almost still, but not perfectly still, because perfect stillness is more of a drawing than a reality. There are slow movements, tiny shifts like breath. A ripple expands, then softens, then disappears into the general hush. The air above is cool, and the darkness has weight, not threatening weight, just present weight, like a blanket that has settled over the whole scene. In that scene, land is not an obvious possibility yet. Land is a stubborn thing. It needs to hold its shape. It needs to resist. It needs to say, I will stay here, even when water would prefer to be everywhere. So when the first mound appears, it feels less like a victory and more like an agreement between conditions that could have stayed unformed. The myth doesn't describe this agreement with contracts and signatures, but you can feel it anyway. Water withdraws, but not in a dramatic retreat. It withdraws in the way water always withdraws when it decides to. Slowly, steadily, with no need to explain itself. It lowers, it shifts, it makes room. It doesn't apologize for being water. It simply allows something else to be possible. And then very gently, the first solid place rises. Not like a mountain leaping out of the flood with a heroic pose. More like a hummock appearing in a marsh when the water level drops, a small swell, a slightly higher patch. Something you might not even notice at first if you weren't looking for it. The universe, in this Hermopolitan mood, is not interested in spectacle. It is interested in stability. So the first mound is stability made visible. You can picture it as a dark shape at first, soaked and heavy. Mud, thick with water, glistening faintly in whatever minimal light exists. Silt gathering. Clay settling. The mound is not clean. It is not polished. It is not a temple platform. It is simply the first place where the world becomes less like a feeling and more like a surface. And because it is the first surface, it changes everything without doing anything exciting. There's a particular kind of quiet relief that comes with having somewhere to stand. Even in your own life, you know this? When you are swimming, your body is always doing little calculations, always making adjustments, always negotiating with the medium around you. When your feet finally touch the bottom, your body relaxes in a way it doesn't even announce. It just lets go of the constant, subtle effort. The first mound is the cosmos touching bottom. It's the moment reality can stop treading water. If that sounds mildly amusing, it should. There is something gently funny about a universe that spends its earliest chapter as an endless flood, and then, at last, produces a small patch of ground as if to say, much better. Not better in a moral sense, just better in a practical sense. Better for building, better for placing. better for separating things into here and there, better for the human habit of making lists and labeling jars and calling one object table and another object not table. But the myth doesn't rush into the labeling. It lingers in the feeling of emergence itself. The first mound takes its time. It rises slowly, like something waking up and sitting up in bed, not in a hurry to open its eyes. It gathers firmness the way wet clay gathers firmness when left alone. If you've ever worked with clay or even just watched mud dry on a path, you know how gradual it is. It doesn't go from liquid to solid in an instant. It goes through a long middle stage where it is neither one thing nor another. It is pliable. It is impressionable. It is full of fingerprints and small marks and tiny ridges. It is the perfect material for beginnings because beginnings are not supposed to be crisp. So the first mound is not a finished place. It is a beginning place. You can imagine it steaming faintly, not with heat, but with the subtle release of moisture into cool air. You can imagine tiny channels where water still runs down its sides, finding lower places, making little grooves that will later become patterns. The mound is a lesson in gravity before gravity has been fully explained. Water still moves, but now it moves around something. That around is important. Around is one of the first words of a formed world. Before the mound, there is no around. There is only in. After the mound, around becomes possible. And with around comes the first hint of structure. The world begins to have an orientation. Up and down become more meaningful. The idea of above lead is not just poetic. It is practical. The mound is the first above. It is the first place that is not submerged in the same way. It is the first refusal of total immersion. In Egyptian imagination, this first mound is often treated as a sacred concept, sometimes associated with the Benben, the primeval mound that emerges from the waters. You don't have to hold the museum version of that idea in your mind right now. You can keep it more simple. A mound is a mound. It's the earliest geometry, a gentle rise. And yet, even as a gentle rise, it is enormous in its consequences. Because once there is a mound, there can be a point. Once there is a point, there can be direction. Once there is direction, there can be movement that means something. A creature can crawl towards something. A wind can move across something. Light later can fall onto something and cast a shadow. The mound is the first object that can cast a shadow, which is a quietly satisfying thought. Darkness existed before light, but shadow, the shape darkness, needs something solid and something bright. The mound prepares the world for that kind of shaped experience. So when the myth says dawn begins not as brightness, but as stability, it's describing this exact feeling. Dawn isn't just the lights turn on. Dawn is the world can hold itself. Stability is the first breath of morning. Think about waking up. The first moment you wake is not always bright. Often it's dim. Often your eyes are half closed. Often your room is still mostly night-colored. But you can feel the shift anyway. The shift is not brightness. The shift is orientation. You know where you are. You know your body is on a surface. You know the room is holding you. That's stability. That's the first breath of morning. You don't need sunlight to feel it. You need a sense that the world is coherent enough to lean on. The first mound is the world becoming coherent enough to lean on. And because this is meant to be sleepy and slow, you can let your mind linger on the small details of how a mound might feel if you stood on it, just hypothetically, just in imagination with no urgency. The surface would be damp, cool, slightly sticky in places where the clay is still wet. Your feet would sink a little, then find resistance. There would be a faint suction when you lift a foot, the friendly inconvenience of mud that hasn't decided if it wants to be land or water. The air would smell like wet earth, like fresh silt, like the promise of plants that haven't arrived yet but are already implied. Even the sound would change. On open water, sound has a certain endless travel. On a surface, sound has a different relationship with the world. A step makes a muffled press instead of a splash. A small movement produces friction instead of ripple. Friction is another word that belongs to formed worlds. And you might notice, without turning it into a lecture, that this moment is deeply Egyptian in temperament. Egypt was a civilization built on the rhythm of flood and withdrawal. The Nile rises, the land disappears into water, and then the waters recede and leave behind new soil. That soil is dark and fertile, and it's literally what makes life possible. The concept of land emerging from water isn't just mythic. It's a yearly experience, scaled up into cosmic language. The first mound is the ultimate Nile recession, the first time anything becomes plantable. Of course the world begins that way in this imagination. Of course it does. It's what the land teaches. And when you think of it like that, the first mound becomes less like a single event and more like a familiar, soothing pattern. Water withdraws, soil appears, the world becomes workable. The cycle is not a war. It's a rhythm. The myth is borrowing that rhythm to describe the beginning of everything, because rhythms are easier to sleep inside than battles. So the mound emerges, and the myth lingers in the calmness of that emergence. It doesn't rush to populate the mound with gods and humans and complicated family drama. It keeps you in the gentle moment where the universe has simply produced a surface. That surface is enough to be interesting because it changes what is possible. A surface is a kind of promise. It promises that something can appear. It promises that something can stand. It promises that something can be placed without sinking forever. The first mound is the first promise that the world will not remain purely fluid, purely ungraspable. It will have a place where things can rest. Rest is important. Rest is sacred, if you think about it in the simplest way. A world that cannot rest is a world that cannot form. So the mound is restfulness shaped into geography, and as it sits there, just a little rise above the flood, you can imagine the 8 forces of the Ogdoad, not as beings standing around applauding, but as conditions balancing themselves. Water settles into a new relationship with space. Infinity remains infinite, but now there is a point inside it. Darkness remains, but now it has a surface to drape over. Hiddenness remains, but now it has somewhere to conceal itself behind. Everything becomes slightly more structured without becoming loud. The first mound doesn't eliminate the earlier conditions. It gives them a place to coordinate. And because you're meant to drift, you can follow the mind's gentle digressions here. Think about how every morning in your own life begins with a kind of mound. Not a literal mound of mud, hopefully, but a first stable point, your bed, your pillow, your blanket. Those are your small pieces of stability. You wake, and you don't immediately solve everything. You simply feel the surface holding you. That is enough to begin with. Egyptian myth in this Hermopolis telling is doing the same thing for the universe. It's giving the cosmos a bed to wake up on, and the humor can remain soft, almost whispered. If the world began in water, perhaps the first thing it wanted was a dry spot, not a big dry spot, just a spot. Just enough for a god to appear without immediately needing to swim. The first mound is the universe quietly preparing a landing zone. Landing zones are underrated. They are not glamorous, but they are essential. Without them, nothing arrives comfortably, and comfort matters in a myth designed for sleep. Comfort is not the opposite of meaning. Comfort is a kind of meaning. The myth says the world begins by making itself comfortable enough to hold a presence. So the mound becomes the first place a presence could appear. Now, appear in this telling is not a theatrical moment. It's not spotlights and fanfare. It's more like the feeling of a shape becoming definite, a place becoming reliable, a surface becoming consistent underfoot. The mound is the first definite thing, not because it is large, but because it is stable. The myth treats stability as the first kind of definiteness, and this is why it says dawn begins not as brightness, but as stability, a place to stand, a surface for a god to appear. Brightness can come later. Brightness is almost a decoration compared to the fundamental achievement of having a surface that does not dissolve. So let your mind stay with the mound. Imagine it slowly firming at the top first, where the air dries it slightly. The edges remain wetter because water loves edges and will always linger there. Tiny puddles gather in shallow depressions. The mound is imperfect like every real beginning. Its shape isn't symmetrical. It's not a perfect cone. It's a patch of earth doing its best, and doing its best is enough. The wind, if you want to allow wind into the scene, moves across the mound and over the water with a soft difference. Over water, the wind glides. Over soil, the wind catches slightly. It makes the air feel textured. Texture is another quiet sign of a formed world. You can't have texture without surfaces. The mound is the first texture. And if you follow this thought gently, you start to see how the myth is building the world in the calmest possible way. First a surface, then texture, then the potential for shadow, then the potential for boundaries, then the potential for names. It's like watching a room slowly furnish itself, but at bedtime speed. No rushing, no dramatic reveal. Just the slow, satisfying fact that the universe has produced a stable spot. And once that spot exists, the world feels less like chaos and more like a planned awakening, not planned in a bureaucratic sense, but planned in the sense that conditions are cooperating rather than colliding. The mound is the first sign that the cosmos can coordinate itself. It can make a place. It can make a beginning. It can prepare a stage without needing to announce that it's doing so. So if you're listening in a quiet room, you can let this image do what it's meant to do. Lower your mental volume. Let the idea of stability settle into your body. Let the world and your imagination become a little less watery, a little more steady, a little more like something you can stand beside without being swept away. And as the mound rests there, dark, damp, patient, the water around it continues its slow breathing. The darkness continues its soft covering, and the hidden continues its veiled presence, until the whole scene feels ready to be treated not as chaos at all, but as a calm beginning that can be approached with the gentlest kind of attention. Imagine that the world does not begin with a trumpet, or a command, or a dramatic clearing of the throat. Imagine it begins the way sleep begins, by small agreements you make with your own body, quiet enough that no one else hears them. A softer pillow, a looser jaw, a shoulder letting go of its habit of being held up like a responsibility. And then, only then, something like dawn becomes possible, not as a victory, but as a gentle permission. So, for this last part, don't picture the Ogdoad as distant monsters, or as a committee of strange-headed gods standing around a cosmic construction site. Picture them as conditions that can be very close to you, so close they're almost ordinary. Dark, depth, stillness, space, the hidden, the endless. Not as threats, not as mysteries you must solve, but as the calm setting around you, like the air in a room when the lights are low and nothing is asking you for anything. The easiest way to do this is to start with what you already have, the room you're in right now. Whatever it looks like in daylight, let it become simpler in your mind. Let it become mostly shapes and quiet. The edges of furniture soften. The ceiling becomes a gentle boundary rather than a surface you need to notice. The floor becomes the idea of support, not the idea of cleaning. The room becomes what a room becomes at night. A place that holds you, not a place that requires you. Now bring Hermopolis closer, not as a journey, not as an adventure, but as a slow overlap. Let your room borrow the mood of a marsh at the edge of first night, not a spooky marsh, a patient one. A marsh that listens, the air cools by one small degree. The silence thickens in the kindest way, like cloth settling. If you want, you can imagine reeds, but keep them quiet. More like the memory of reeds than the full, sharp picture. You don't need detail that wakes you up. You need detail that drifts. In this overlap, Nun and Nana are not characters you have to watch. They are the sensation of depth beneath everything. Not water splashing, not waves performing, just the sense that beneath the surface of the world there is a steady, ancient press, like cool darkness against skins. It is there, and it is not trying to impress you. It is the oldest background. Het and Howhet are not a dizzying infinity you must stare into until your forehead tightens. They are simply the fact that your thoughts don't need a wall right now. You don't need to finish the day in your mind. You don't need the last number. You don't need the final sentence. There is room. There is enough room for you to stop trying. Kek and Kauket are not villains. They are the lights being low on purpose. They are the darkness that lets the world keep its softness. They are the privacy of night. They are the part of the universe that understands that bright attention can be harsh, and that beginnings and sleep do better when they are not stared at too hard. Amun and Amonit are the hidden, not as absence, but as veil. They are the gentle truth that you don't have to understand everything to be safe. Some forces remain behind linen and lamplight. Some workings do their work without showing you the gears. This is not deceit, it is design. If you let all of that sit around you, the Ogdoad becomes less like a myth and more like an atmosphere. The atmosphere does not demand belief. It only offers a mood, the mood of pre-dawn, when the world is still not quite itself, but it is already preparing to be. And now, quietly, you make an oath. Not a loud oath, not the kind spoken in a courtroom or carved into stone, but the kind spoken inside the chest where the breath is. A bedtime oath? An oath that belongs to the small, ordinary part of you that still knows how to be gentle. The oath can start as a simple instruction. Let the room be still. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Not because stillness is fragile, but because stillness is useful. Stillness is the first tool of the night. The first tool of creation too, if you believe Hermopolis. Not hammering, not shouting. Just stillness that holds long enough for shapes to settle. And you might notice how often you do the opposite in daily life. You stir yourself constantly. You refresh, you check, you adjust. You reopen thoughts you already closed. Like a person who keeps getting out of bed to make sure the door is locked. There's a soft humor to this because the world is rarely improved by the 10th check. It is usually improved by sleep. So your bedtime oath can be, I will not reopen every door in my mind tonight. I will let some doors remain closed without needing to prove they're closed. I will let the hidden remain hidden. I will let darkness be a keeper. I will let depth be depth. This oath does not require you to be perfect. It requires you to be willing. Now imagine the first mound, the first place above the flood, not as a mountain, but as the simplest stable thought, a surface. A place to stand, a place where something can rest without sinking. You can borrow that image for yourself. You don't need to build a whole life tonight. You only need a small surface of stability inside your body. It can be as basic as noticing the weight of your head on your pillow. That is your mound. It is where your mind can stop treading water, or the weight of your hands resting, not doing anything useful, which is secretly useful. Or the gentle support of the mattress under your back. A surface, stability, a place to stand, or in this case, a place to lie. And once you have that, you can feel why the myth says dawn begins not as brightness, but as stability. Stability is what allows the next thing to happen without strain. Without stability, even light would be stressful. Light would arrive in a world that cannot hold it, and everything would scatter. So your oath can be, I will become stable enough to hold my own quiet. I will not demand brightness from myself right now. I will not demand clarity. I will only demand softness. Now the oath becomes more specific because specific oaths are easier to keep and also slightly funnier in a mild, sleepy way. Vague promises can feel dramatic. Specific promises feel domestic. So you can promise small things. You can promise to stop clenching your teeth. It sounds absurdly practical for an ancient Egyptian myth, that the gods of Hermopolis would probably approve of practical things. They are, after all, forces of condition, not forces of spectacle. You can promise to let your tongue rest in your mouth like it belongs there, not like it's bracing for impact. You can promise to let your eyebrows stop trying to solve problems. You can promise to let your eyes be heavy without apologizing. Each of these is a tiny withdrawal of water, a tiny emergence of land. Each is the first mound repeated in the body, a small surface where calm can appear. And if your mind interrupts, because minds do that, politely and impolitely, if it presents you with a thought like a frog suddenly calling out in the dark, you don't have to chase it. You can let it echo once and then let it sink back into the black water. Thoughts are allowed to be like that at bedtime, present then gone, not because you defeated them, because you didn't feed them. That too is part of the oath. I will not feed every thought tonight. The Ogdoad in this bedtime mode becomes a gentle set of helpers for that promise. Nun and Nonnet remind you that a thought can sink into depth and still exist without being held in your hands. Hey and Howie remind you that you do not need to reach the edge of a thought to be done with it. Kek and Kalkit remind you that darkness is not a sign of danger. It is a sign that the world is allowed to rest. Amen and Amonet remind you that not understanding something fully does not mean it is unsolved. It may simply be veiled. And now, the central oath, the one the myth wants you to hold, arrives in a sentence that is almost too gentle to be called a sentence. Dawn is not a fight. Dawn is a gentle agreement between forces that could have stayed unformed. Hold that thought without gripping it. Let it sit on your mind the way a blanket sits on a body, present, warming, not tight. Dawn is not a fight. If you've spent a lot of your life treating mornings like battles against sleep, battles against time, battles against your own reluctance, this idea may feel unfamiliar. But the myth isn't asking you to believe it forever. It's asking you to try it for one night, to let dawn be an agreement rather than a victory march. Because if dawn is an agreement, then night is not an enemy. Night is the negotiating room where everything becomes possible. Night is where the terms are set softly. Night is where the world decides, in its slow way, to become workable again. So tonight, let your mind be like Hermopolis, calm marsh water, patient, allowing shapes to settle. Notice how calming it is to allow rather than force. To allow your breath to come and go without making it prove anything. To allow your chest to rise without checking if it rose enough. To allow your stomach to soften without demanding a reason. To allow your legs to be heavy without interpreting heaviness as failure. In the language of the myth, heaviness is simply gravity doing its job. Gravity is a stable condition. You can trust it. And as you trust these small conditions, you can feel the world becoming less like chaos and more like a planned awakening. Not because someone planned it with a clipboard, but because the forces within you are capable of cooperation. This is, in a quiet way, the most comforting kind of power that cooperates. If you want to add a small ritual to the oath, something gently boring, something repetitive in a soothing way, you can imagine the room becoming a marsh one detail at a time, and then letting that detail go. The air is cool. You don't need to measure it. The darkness is present. You don't need to defeat it. The space is wide. You don't need to fill it. The hidden is veiled. You don't need to lift the veil. The water is deep. You don't need to touch the bottom. Each line is a small surrender, not a surrender to fear, a surrender to permission. And if you notice yourself wanting to do bedtime correctly, you can let a little dry humor in, very soft. Bedtime has never required a perfect performance. Sleep has always been the one audience that leaves as soon as it's satisfied, and it never writes reviews. You don't have to impress it. You only have to let it happen. So the oath can be, I will stop trying to impress sleep tonight, and then naturally the world begins to quiet further, because the pressure to perform is one of the loudest noises a mind can make. In the marsh of Hermopolis, as the world prepares for dawn, the reeds stop moving. Not because something dramatic happened, but because the air has settled. The frogs fall quiet. Not because they were silenced, but because even frogs understand pauses. The black water holds the last starlight without showing off. The first mound sits there, damp and patient, like a thought that has decided it can wait until morning to become a plan. And somewhere beyond all of it, beyond the flood, beyond the veil, beyond the habit of needing to point at a source, the sun prepares to wake. Not with urgency, not with triumph. With the slow, ordinary dignity of something that rises, because rising is what it does. You don't have to watch it. You don't have to wait for it. You can let your eyes remain closed while it prepares itself. You can let your own mind do the same, closing gently, settling into the dark that isn't evil, into the hidden that isn't absence, into the depth that isn't danger, into the space that isn't empty. And as you hold your bedtime oath softly, loosely, the room remains still, the marsh remains. Patient, the world remains quiet enough that even the idea of dawn feels like a distant, gentle agreement made somewhere far beyond the black water where nothing needs to hurry and nothing needs to announce itself.